She doesn't even know what she signed. By the time the sale closes, her name won't matter anyway. Just make sure the transfer goes through before she figures it out. He was standing in the kitchen, 20 feet from where Renée Calloway sat at the top of the stairs with a glass of water she'd never gotten around to drinking. It was 1:47 in the morning. She'd woken up thirsty, heard his voice and stopped. She didn't move, she didn't breathe loud, she just listened. The notary's already been paid, the condo in Whistler, the Calgary account, the investment portfolio, all of it restructured. She's a co-signer on paper, but not in any way that gives her access once the filing goes through. Trust me, she'll get the news the same morning the lawyers do. Renée sat there on the third step from the top, her bare feet cold against the hardwood, and felt something inside her go completely, terrifyingly still. She had married Philip Vance on a Thursday in September, 8 years ago, in a small ceremony outside of Kelowna, with 43 guests and her grandmother's ring. She had believed, genuinely believed, that she was marrying a man who saw her, not for what she could do for him, not for what she carried in her background. The family trust, the commercial real estate portfolio her father had built over 40 years, the connections she'd quietly inherited along with everything else. She had believed she was marrying someone who looked at all of that and chose her anyway. It had taken 8 years to understand the order of that sentence was wrong. Renée Calloway was 39 years old the night she sat on those stairs. She had grown up in Vancouver, in a house that never announced its wealth but wore it quietly. Good art on the walls, good wine in the cellar, a father who drove a 10-year-old Volvo because he said new cars were for people who had something to prove. Her mother had been a family court lawyer until she retired. Renée had grown up around documents, agreements, the fine print of things. She had a good eye for language. She noticed when words were chosen carefully. She had studied architecture at UBC. After graduating, she'd spent 3 years with a firm in Toronto before her father asked her to come back and help manage the family's property holdings. It wasn't a glamorous return. It was spreadsheets and tenant calls and city permits and zoning hearings. But she was good at it, quietly and efficiently good, and she had found, somewhere in the process of doing unglamorous work well, that she liked knowing exactly where things stood. She'd met Philip at a charity gala in Yaletown. He was charming in the way of men who've practiced it, not falsely but deliberately. He had a small commercial development firm, mid-tier projects, some early success, ambition that needed fuel. He was attractive and attentive and laughed at the right moments. He called her the next morning. He remembered things she'd mentioned only once. He asked questions and listened to the answers. She had thought, this is a man who pays attention. What she hadn't understood yet was what he was paying attention to. Within 2 years of their marriage, Renée's organizational instincts had been folded entirely into Philip's company. She hadn't planned it that way. It had happened gradually, the way most erosions do, one reasonable request at a time. He needed help restructuring a contract. She knew someone. He was losing a key investor. Could she make a call? She knew someone. He had a project stalling because of a zoning conflict she'd navigated once before. Could she just take a look? She took a look. She solved it. She moved on to the next thing. By the time she understood, she'd quietly become the operational backbone of Vance Property Development. Her own name appeared nowhere that mattered. She wasn't listed as a partner. She wasn't on the company documents as anything other than a spouse. She had introduced him to the investor who'd funded his biggest project, a mixed-use development in North Vancouver that had made him genuinely wealthy. And there was no contract, no acknowledgement, not even an email that clearly traced her role in making that introduction. She had trusted him. That was the short version. And she had been busy. Busy managing his world, which meant neglecting to protect her own position within it. Her father's trust was structured separately, and that remained hers. But the years of contributions, the contacts, the knowledge, the solving of problems that looked unsolvable, none of that had a paper trail with her name on it. She had mentioned it once, maybe 2 years into their marriage. She had suggested, reasonably and without drama, that perhaps they should revisit the prenuptial agreement now that the shape of things had changed. Philip had laughed. Not unkindly. He'd said, Renée, you're my wife, not a contractor. I'm not paying you for being part of this family. And she had let it go, because she'd believed they were building something together. And itemizing contributions felt like a small, unromantic way to think about a marriage. She'd been wrong about what they were building. She saw that clearly now, sitting on the stairs at 1:47 in the morning. She didn't go back to bed. She waited until she heard Philip end the call, heard the click of the kitchen light, heard his footsteps move toward the bedroom at the other end of the house. She waited another 10 minutes after that. Then she went downstairs, poured the water down the sink, set the glass quietly on the counter, and walked to the small room she used as a home office. She didn't turn on the overhead light. She sat in the glow of her laptop screen and she made a list. She was not a person who acted from emotion. She had been raised by a family court lawyer and a man who read every clause before he signed anything, and whatever else that upbringing had given her, it had given her that. The understanding that emotion was information, not instruction. What she felt right now was cold, deliberate clarity. She was angry somewhere underneath it, yes. She was also something closer to grief. Not for Philip, not yet, but for the version of herself who had signed things without reading them because she trusted the person handing her the pen. But grief could wait. Lists could not. She wrote down everything she'd heard. She wrote down the Whistler condo, the Calgary account, the investment portfolio. She wrote down the word notary and the phrase before she figures it out, and the word filing. She wrote down the name he'd been talking to. She didn't know it yet, but she would. She wrote down the time, 1:47 a.m., the date, the exact phrasing she remembered. Then she opened her email and wrote to her family's lawyer. Not a firm Philip had ever used. Not anyone connected to his world. She wrote to Sabine Tremblay, who had handled her father's estate, who had drafted the original family trust documents, who had known Renée since she was a teenager, arguing with her parents about curfew. She wrote, "I need to meet with you tomorrow, first thing. Please don't call the house phone." She wrote it, then reconsidered, then added, "It's time sensitive." She didn't send it from her usual email. She logged into an old account she hadn't used in years, one that predated her marriage, that Philip had no knowledge of and no access to. She'd never thought she'd need it. She sent the message, and then she sat there in the dark, very still, and thought about what she knew and what she didn't. What she knew: Philip had been actively working, with outside help, to restructure their shared assets before filing for divorce. The notary had been arranged. The Calgary account, which she'd believed was jointly held, had apparently been moved or altered. The Whistler property, which they'd bought together using proceeds from the sale of a property that had been hers before the marriage, had been placed somewhere beyond easy reach. What she didn't know yet: the exact legal structure, the name of whoever he was working with, whether the prenuptial agreement had been altered in ways she hadn't noticed, whether there were other assets she wasn't aware of. She was not going to confront him. That was the first and most important decision she made in that dark office. She was not going to walk into that bedroom, wake him up, and give him the information that she knew. Because the moment she did that, the only advantage she had, the fact that he didn't know she'd heard him, would disappear, and she needed that advantage. She needed it badly enough to walk back upstairs, get into the same bed, and lie there with her eyes open until the light changed. Sabine Tremblay had a corner office in a building on West Georgia. She was in her late 60s, small and precise. With silver hair she wore short and reading glasses she was always losing. She had the manner of someone who had spent decades listening to people in crisis, and had learned that the most useful thing she could offer was efficiency. Renée was in her office by 8:15 the next morning, 20 minutes before Philip typically woke up. She told Sabine everything. Sabine listened without interrupting. When Renée finished, Sabine took off her glasses, set them on the desk, and said, "All right, tell me what you have access to right now." That was the question. Renée had access to her personal accounts, which were entirely hers and always had been. The family trust, a savings account she'd maintained since before the marriage, a small investment account in her name only. Those totaled a significant but not enormous sum. What she had no clear picture of was the joint architecture. The accounts they'd opened together, the properties she'd signed onto, the investments she'd contributed to, but that carried his name or his company's name at the top of the paperwork. "I need to see everything," Sabine said. "Not what you think you know, what you can actually document." Renée had already started. She had spent the night, the hours between 3 and 7 in the morning, going through every file she could access quietly. Not his laptop. She hadn't touched his laptop, but hers, and the shared cloud folder where household documents lived, and her own careful memory of every signature she'd put on anything over 8 years. The prenuptial agreement was the first thing she'd reread. She had signed it at 31, 2 months before the wedding, in a lawyer's office that Philip had arranged. She remembered thinking it was reasonable. It had seemed reasonable. And she remembered not scrutinizing it the way she would have scrutinized a property contract. Because it hadn't felt like a property contract. It had felt like a formality, a legal acknowledgement of what they already understood between them. She looked at it again at 4 in the morning with different eyes, and found 2 clauses she hadn't thought about in years. One pertained to assets acquired before the marriage. One pertained to business interests developed during the marriage in which a spouse's contribution was, and this was the word the document used, informal. Not documented, not contracted, informal. Her 8 years of contribution to his company would, under a strict reading of that clause, be classified as informal. She set the document down. Then she picked it up again and photographed every page. Sabine moved quickly. That was what Renée needed most. Not sympathy, not outrage on her behalf, but speed and precision. Sabine filed a formal request for financial disclosure through the appropriate channels, which triggered a legal obligation to produce records of all assets. She contacted a forensic accountant Renée had never met, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osiadu who worked out of a firm in Burnaby, who began tracing the movement of funds through the Calgary account and the corporate structure of Vance Property Development. What Dr. Osiadu found within 4 business days was that the Calgary account had been reclassified, not emptied but restructured in a way that removed Renée's name from the primary signatory position and placed a numbered company in its place. That numbered company was registered in Alberta. Its director was listed as a holding firm. That holding firm, when traced, led back to the same name on its board, Philip Vance. She also found records indicating the Whistler property had been placed under a corporate umbrella 2 months earlier. Again a numbered company, again connected, eventually, to Philip. The transfer had not yet completed. That was the crucial detail. They had moved quickly but not quickly enough. Renée's lawyers filed an urgent application to the BC Supreme Court. A judge granted a temporary restraining order on the transfer of both properties and the Calgary account, pending full financial disclosure. The order came through on a Wednesday morning, while Philip was at a site meeting for a project in Surrey. That same morning, Renée was at a coffee shop in Kitsilano, sitting across from her oldest friend, a woman named Soar McLeod who'd been her roommate at UBC, and was now a financial planner in North Vancouver. Soar had known about the marriage for years. She had kept most of her opinions about Philip to herself, the way good friends sometimes do. Now she sat across from Renée with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, and didn't say "I told you" or "I always wondered." She just said, "What do you need?" Renée said, "I need a place to have my mail forwarded that isn't the house, and I need you to help me put together a timeline of every time I made an introduction, or solved a problem for his business, because I'm going to need it documented." Suorse opened her notebook. The documentation was the part that mattered most, and it was the part that took the longest. Renée had kept things. She didn't think of herself as a careful person, but she was in the way of people who've grown up watching adults read things before signing them. She had kept emails, she had kept text messages, she had kept screenshots of conversations where Philip had explicitly asked her to contact someone on behalf of his company. She had the original email chain where she'd introduced him to the investor who'd funded the North Vancouver project. She had a series of messages where she'd walked him through a zoning appeal process, using knowledge she'd developed working for her family's portfolio. She had dinner receipts from meals she'd organized and attended on his company's behalf, where her name appeared in the reservation, where she'd been the one the city councilor had called back. None of it was a formal contract. All of it was a record. Dr. Osiadu helped them assign a number to it. Not a guess, a methodical calculation based on the documented value of each contribution, cross-referenced with market rates for the kind of consulting and networking work Renée had performed. The North Vancouver project alone, where her introduction had unlocked a financing relationship Philip had been unable to secure on his own, was quantified at a specific contribution value. The zoning appeal she'd solved had a documented outcome that increased the project value by a calculable amount. By the time the legal team had assembled the full picture, the number was significant. It was not the number Philip had imagined this divorce would cost him. Not by a considerable distance. He called her on a Thursday afternoon 6 days after the court order had been served. He did not sound like himself. There was a tightness in his voice that she'd heard only rarely, once when a major deal fell through, once when his father had been ill. He said her name, then paused. She let the pause sit there. "I think we need to talk," he said. "I agree," Renée said. "Your lawyer can call mine." She ended the call and set the phone on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment looking out the window at the back garden. The Japanese maple was turning red. It had been her idea to plant it. She'd picked it out, arranged delivery, spent a Saturday afternoon digging the hole with help from the woman next door. There was almost nothing in this house that she hadn't put care into. She made a decision about the maple later. She would take a cutting. She would grow a new one wherever she went next. What Renée had not expected, had not allowed herself to think about in the focused precision of those first 2 weeks, was how tired she was. Not from the process. The process was almost clarifying. She had given her brain something specific to do with the adrenaline, and it had done it. But underneath that, in the hours after the lawyers stopped calling and the house was quiet, there was an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the legal work. It was the exhaustion of looking back at 8 years and recalculating everything. She didn't do it with hatred. That surprised her. She had expected hatred, or something in the range of it. Contempt, fury, the kind of cold sustained anger that would make the whole thing easier to move through. What she found instead was something more complicated, and in some ways more useful. She found clarity. She could see looking back exactly where she had stopped asking questions. Not because she was naive, because she had chosen trust over vigilance and then rationalized that choice as love. She could see the first time she'd suggested revisiting the prenuptial agreement, and had let herself be charmed out of insisting. She could see the evening she'd noticed her name wasn't on the North Vancouver project documents, and decided it would be awkward to raise it then. She could trace, almost step by step, the series of small decisions she'd made to preserve harmony at the expense of protection. This was not a story about being deceived by someone unreadable. Philip had been readable eventually, she simply hadn't been reading. She told Saworsi this one evening, sitting on Saworsi's back deck in the early autumn dark, a glass of wine that neither of them was really drinking sitting on the table between them. Source said, "You're being harder on yourself than is warranted." Renée said, "I'm being exactly as hard on myself as is useful, and then I'm stopping there." Source looked at her for a moment. "That's very you, I know." The settlement was negotiated over 11 weeks. Philip's initial position was what she'd expected. An attempt to minimize her documented contributions, to characterize her work as spousal support rather than professional contribution, to lean on the informal clause in the prenuptial agreement. His legal team was good. They were also working against the documented record Renée and Dr. Osiedu had assembled, and that record was specific in a way that made minimization difficult. The Whistler property, restored to joint ownership and subsequently listed. The proceeds were divided in a way that acknowledged her contribution to the initial purchase. The Calgary account. Restructured contributions acknowledged. Her portion, plus interest calculated from the date of the restructuring, returned. The investment portfolio, an independent assessment conducted, her documented contributions to business development credited against a fair value share. Her legal team had also made a referral to the Law Society. The notary who had participated in the restructuring, without proper consent from both signatories, was the subject of a complaint. That process moved separately from the divorce proceedings. But it moved. Philip's name appeared in documents related to that inquiry that would remain on the professional record. Renée had not pushed for that outcome, but she had not stopped it either. She moved out on a Saturday in November, which in Vancouver meant rain, the particular flat gray light that sat over the city for months and turned everything the same color. She wasn't sad to be leaving in the rain. She had always liked November in Vancouver. She found something honest about a city that didn't try to be cheerful when it wasn't. The apartment she'd rented was in a building on the edge of Mount Pleasant, a neighborhood that was changing but hadn't finished changing yet. There were still old hardware stores next to new coffee shops, still a Portuguese bakery on the corner that opened at 6 in the morning. She liked the mix. She liked that nothing about it felt curated. She had brought with her the things that were unambiguously hers. The art she'd chosen before she'd met Philip, the books, the dishes her mother had given her, a lamp she'd found at an estate sale in Gastown years ago. She had taken a cutting from the Japanese maple, wrapped in damp cloth, and she had a pot waiting for it near the window where the light would be right in spring. Source came to help carry boxes. She brought takeout from a Thai place they'd eaten at in their university years, which somehow still existed and was somehow still the same. They sat on the floor of the mostly empty apartment and ate pad see ew out of containers and talked until it was late. At some point Sear said, "Are you okay?" Renée considered the question, which she'd been asked in many forms by many people over the preceding weeks. She'd given a range of answers, some of them more honest than others. "I think I'm something I haven't been in a while," she said finally. "What's that?" "Sure of myself." There was one thing she hadn't told anyone, not Source, not Sabine, not even the therapist she'd started seeing every other Thursday. The night she'd overheard the call, the night she'd sat on the stairs and then gone quietly to her office and begun making her list, she had felt something besides clarity and cold determination. She had felt, underneath it all, a kind of recognition, as though some part of her had been waiting for this, not wanting it, not expecting it, but not entirely surprised either. She had pushed that feeling away at the time because there was work to do. But it came back in the quieter weeks that followed, and she sat with it rather than away from it, because that was the thing she was learning to do. Sit with the things she'd been moving past. She understood, in those quiet November evenings in the new apartment, that she had known something was wrong for longer than she'd admitted to herself. She had known and she had chosen, again and again, the easier version of the truth, that the small things were just the small things, that the pattern she was half seeing was not a pattern, that the care she was putting in would eventually be met with something equal. She had used trust as a reason not to look clearly. She was done using it that way. That didn't mean she was done with trust itself. She thought of her father, who had trusted people all his life and verified it with signed agreements, and managed somehow to hold both things at once without cynicism. She thought of Sayorse, who had sat with her on this floor and eaten takeout in the middle of her life falling apart, and asked the right question at the right time. She thought of Sabine, who had taken her call at 8 in the morning and said, "Tell me what you have access to right now. Not how are you, not I'm so sorry, but what do you have?" Let's start there. She had people. She had always had people. She'd just been directing her energy somewhere else. The following spring, Renée started a consulting practice. It was not a dramatic pivot. It was the obvious thing. She had been doing the work for years already, just without her name on it. Now her name was on it. She worked with small commercial developers navigating zoning applications and investor relationship. She was good at it in a way she didn't have to argue about. The results were self-evident. Her first 2 clients were people she'd met through her own family's network. People who'd seen her solve problems quietly and had always wondered if she was available separately. She set up her office in a corner of the Mount Pleasant apartment, which was larger than it looked, with a window that faced east and caught the morning light in a way she hadn't anticipated when she'd signed the lease. The Japanese maple cutting had taken root. It sat on the window ledge in a terracotta pot, small and green and extremely alive. She did not talk about the divorce in professional contexts. She did not tell the story to clients. But occasionally, in a coffee meeting or a dinner with people who'd become something like friends over the years, it would come up. Not the details, but the shape of it. The particular situation of a person who had contributed everything and been positioned to receive nothing. When that happened, people sometimes asked her what she wished she'd done differently. She had a consistent answer. "I would have treated my own contributions the way I treated a legal document," she said. "I would have written them down. I would have named them. I would have made sure my name was on them." She paused, usually here, in the way of someone choosing the next words carefully. "Not because I expected betrayal, because it's important to be able to read your own life clearly. You can love someone completely and still be honest about what you've built and what you're owed. Those things aren't in conflict. I just didn't understand that for a long time." She understood it now. The maple turned red that October, the way they do. Slowly, then all at once. She photographed it on a Tuesday morning with the east light coming through the window, and she didn't post the photo anywhere or send it to anyone. She just kept it. Proof of something small and alive that she had carried out of the wreckage and replanted and tended until it held.